So, hey, I just when you did the four stages of movement the other day with Bryce, I've done this before, but I love the way you walked through it. I learned a lot of things, especially toward the institutional side, how you described it and stuff. So, just if you can, and I know you don't have a lot of time, but walk through the four phases of movement from your perspective, right?
Hmm.
And then camp out on that institutional phase. I thought you did really had some great insights on that, Jim. And then you talked about like what happens after institutional, right? When we
Hmm.
have to make a choice and what happens. So, man, just start it. If you want to share screen, yeah, perfect too.
Yeah, I'll share the slide.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
I thought you did a really good job of because it's such a powerful tool um at giving us a kind of like, oh, all right, so you're up.
All right. Well, first of all, that you got to understand that not all work gets to movement, but this describes the common themes of those engagements that do get to movement. And there's not a right or wrong. uh it's not that one phase is right and the others are wrong. This is a natural progression, and quite frankly, if every church in the world could get to institutional, we'd be better off, because that means
Good
that the
word.
underlying culture values what goes on in that building,
Mm-hmm.
right? But
Yep.
this is the natural progression of how it happens, and it's important to note that even though these are shown here as equal time periods, that's not the scale. It could be that phase one lasts for 50 years, and the movement may last for 5 years. Um, so it's important to understand that these are not to scale. The dots represent gospel shares, and every movement that we're familiar with always begins with an outside catalyst. These don't just bubble up from within a people group without some kind of sort of outside initiative. So think of a missionary going into an unreached location, and they're sharing the gospel, and they may be doing this again for years and years and years. But if they're ever going to get to movement, people will start coming to faith in Christ. And those believers, if they are discipled, will start to gather into what we call simple church or house church. And this may go on again for a long, long time. But the inflection point, that the sort of the tipping point that outside missionary is looking for, is indigenous ownership of that movement. It's core, or it's local ownership of the core missionary tasks. That is the gold standard for what that outside uh, uh,
Catalyst.
catalyst is trying to get to. And so what happens then? Gospel shares accelerate, because you go from a few people doing everything to a lot of people sharing the gospel. And so activity accelerates. You start to see more people come to faith in Christ. You start to see churches multiply. And when you get towards the end of that movement, you start to see uh, uh, the church begin to formalize. You'll start to see purpose-built worship centers, and you'll start to see gifted leaders pop up, so that the expectations and the requirements for leadership start to improve, start to get elevated, which is a good thing, right? Now, if it's going to formalize, it will pass into this next phase where the 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 meeting place starts to change. You'll see simple church start to die away, and it moves towards a more formal meeting place, purpose-built buildings. Congregations will expand, and you may even start to get some sort of parachurch activity, like orphanages or health clinics, or maybe primary schools. But in other words, the church is now beginning to impact the culture, right? And as a result, that's part of what allows it to formalize. That the underlying the cultural context, they are starting to find some value in the church. and we start to see more and more gifted leaders, and the types of leaders start to change a little bit. Back under movement, it's almost exclusively bivocational. You don't have a professionalized clergy for the most part. As you move into formalization, you start to see that shift. It's not completely professional yet, but it's getting there. And as a result, you have people that are better prepared educationally. The expectations and the responsibilities for leadership have really begun to improve here. But you'll notice that the gospel shares start to slow down a little bit because the church is now becoming rooted to a place. It's no longer a movement, or it's less of a movement than it was. And now it's a place, and it's a place that is beginning to be valued by the surrounding populace. Now, the sweet spot for persecution is right in here. In other words, at the beginning, there's not a lot of persecution because they haven't had an impact. It's not doing anything. It's not challenging anything. But as people start to come to faith in Christ and it begins to turn into a movement, that's when the surrounding culture starts to question the validity and the value of this new religious system, and so persecution really heats up during movement, and persecution will often keep a movement going longer than it would normally go, because if the local population accepts Christianity readily and sees value in what's going on, it'll move to formalization pretty quickly, and people will start paying to fund buildings, and the church will begin to formalize. But it may stay in that persecution phase for a much longer period, which in many ways will tend to extend movement. What we find is one of the quickest ways to slow down a movement is for outsiders to come in and start paying for buildings, because essentially you are accelerating the move into formalization before the culture is necessarily ready for it. So you're taking the outward expansion out of the movement and trying to root it to a place. And so you're moving it into formalization and eventually to institutionalization much more quickly. The example that I always give, if you look at China in the 50s and 60s, there was a big underground movement, and towards the 70s and 80s, it started to become above ground, and purpose-built buildings started to get built. And then all of a sudden, after Tiananmen Square, the government cracked down again and basically pushed it back underground. The underground church movement had slowed headed into that period, and the Chinese authorities pushed it back underground and basically pushed it back into movement again. Didn't allow it to formalize. So, but assuming that it does get to formalization, again, what has allowed that is Christianity now has a foothold, and at least a percentage of the population sees value in that. And so the persecution slows down, and it allows the church to come above ground. And ultimately, if that continues, it will move into institutional, which is where we have been for the majority of our experience here in the United States. Because now you see that simple church has almost completely gone away. And so now the church is valued. The underlying culture accepts it and really values now what goes on inside of those buildings. So if you build a nice building, you put attractive programs, and you have charismatic leaders in there, that building now, that church building, will have a gravitational pull to it. But you see what's going on with gospel shares. They start to slow down because the proclamation is now going on inside the building, and people are coming to hear it. So it's been a very effective method in a culture that sees widespread value in the church. It works. And you see that church. In fact, Kenneth Scott Latourette, in his magnum opus, The History of Christianity, he has a really, really well developed passage in there that talks about the institutional church as being the most constructive force for the betterment and the dignity of mankind in the history of the world. Just you look at it by any measure, whether it's education, literacy, health, you name it. At professions like nursing have come out of Christian practice. And so that institutional church model has extraordinary value. And you see them building colleges and universities, hospitals, schools, you name it. And so it has great value. And those institutions are pumping out gifted leaders like crazy. And those gifted leaders now are very mature doctrinally. And so this church tends to be very stable from a doctrinal standpoint. The average believer has a great deal of doctrinal literacy, and in fact, you find average Christians in this institutional church that have more Christian training than the pastors do here in phases 1 and 2. But there's not a lot of outward expansion going on here. Again, the model is based upon an underlying acceptance of the church and a valuing of what goes on in that building. And this
one of the things you talked about, Jim, I thought was good was, and you might get into this, I certainly don't, is lots of resources, high.
Yes.
Yes. And I thought that, I'm sorry.
Absolutely. In fact, this, and part of that is what is this cultural transformation? It is believers that are pooling their resources for the betterment of their communities, not only spiritually, certainly focused spiritually, but physically. Again, feeding the poor, healthcare, education, sanitation, all of these things are benefited by this massive the massive power and influence of the institutional church. Now, from a missional perspective, we've always looked at this institutional church as having a one-way pipeline headed back into the unreached and movement phases. So in other words, we take the spiritual maturity and the resources of the institutional church and we transfer them into phases 1 and 2 to help those churches develop. Now, what has occurred here is we're now in the United States, at least in my opinion, we're off the chart now. We're into what I would call a phase 5.
You're over here. You're bumping up.
Which is post-Christian. So what has happened now is the culture has moved on in the sense that a greater and greater percentage of the population, and it's accelerating rapidly, a greater and greater percentage of that population no longer values what happens inside that building. And so the gravitational pull theory that we have depended upon in the institutional model to fill the pews is not as strong as it once was. Now, it's not dead, and nobody's arguing that we should burn down the institutional church model. In fact, I would continue to argue that is the gold standard. If every church in the world could get to institutional, it would mean that we had won. That cultures all over the world now accept the church and allow it to thrive and prosper. We know that's not the case, and we know. For instance, look at Dallas-Fort Worth. What happens when you take 120,000 South Asians that grew up over here in phases 1 and 2? They've been taught that the church is evil, and that it is diametrically opposed to their culture. And then you fly them over here and drop them in this institutional environment. They are not going to walk through the front door of your church. It doesn't matter what you put inside there. They are not going to do it. And so we have to learn as an institutional church how our brothers and sisters over here in phases 1 and 2 are reaching people who are not interested in what happens inside of a church. And so it's not that we need to abandon what we're doing. It's not an either or, it's a both and. And so we have to recognize that the underlying culture is shifting, and it's shifting really rapidly for a whole bunch of factors. And so this institutional church, once it falls off the edge of this chart, and the cultural foundation that it depended upon shifts, we got a choice. We can either accept that the culture has changed and we can ride this graph down and just realize that we're going to be a remnant in an increasingly hostile environment, or we can go back to a movement focused orientation and add that to what we're doing and just treat this like a mission field like anywhere else in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and Latin, in South Asia. And that's why we think that this sort of missional pipeline, it's got to go both ways now. We've still got to, as the institutional church, share the resources that we've been entrusted with and the spiritual maturity that we've been blessed with, and the training resources and so on and so forth to help that movement church. But we got to learn from that movement church and add some of the disciplines and the strategies that they use to reach their culture. We got to bring it back here. Now, I think it's important to understand why this occurs, and for that, let's move on. If you go back here to movement, these P's represent the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer. Now, we still talk about the priesthood of the believer, but it's really, really strong in movement, and in a movement phase, every disciple is a disciple maker. So you got a lot of people doing a lot of work, and that's how you get to movement. As you move into formalization and the leadership starts to take on more and more responsibility, the priesthood of the believer, it still exists, but the responsibility of the average believer starts to diminish. And by the time you get over here to institutional, we still talk about it, but it's no longer every believer, it's not their responsibility to be out evangelizing. In fact, what happens under an attractional model is it's our responsibility to meet and invite people to come back to the building and be evangelized by the professionals, by the folks that we now pay to do that work. And again, it's worked really well for a really long time, but those days are rapidly passing us by. And if we continue to ride that model exclusively, we're just going to ride this graph down. Now, the sweet spot for movement is right in here. Essentially, towards the end of movement, where you've got these gifted leaders popping up, those guys start to become, and in some cases, girls. Sometimes it's women in these roles. But these people are focused on now sort of shepherding networks of churches, and the really talented ones, the ones that really have a movement mindset, they will try to delay formalization as long as they can by breaking things up. So if they got a congregation that gets up to 150 people and they're meeting in the courtyard of a house and they're bursting at the seams, and the congregation starts to talk about building a building, they'll say, nah, why don't you take 10 families off and go start another one in the next village, and you take 10 families and go off, start another. They keep breaking it up and sending it out. Now, ultimately, if they're successful, they will move into formalization naturally, and it will be a good thing. But the really gifted movement-minded leaders, that's not the gold standard in their mind. That's not what they're pushing for. They're pushing to keep it in movement for as long as they can, and then let the formalization happen naturally. And in fact, they're not out looking for outside money to build buildings. They will stiff arm people that are trying to do that. But again, because they don't want to force it into formalization too quickly. So again, our focus at E3 is to work this thing from both directions. In other words, how do we continue to provide pathways for the institutional church to be very strategic in its involvement in unreached and movement areas? We kind of see ourselves as fishing guides. If you want to go fishing where there's unreached people groups, we'll put you on the fish, and then we're gonna help you do very strategic things moving from right to left.
Can I
However,
make a
we're
comment?
also sure.
Okay. Well, let me just say one thing. And this is so over here in the institutional phase, Jim, to
Mm-hmm.
made the multiply the processes we're using, what they do for a period, like that Saturday training, it takes people over here and for just a few hours, it kind of drops them over here.
That's right. That's
With
right.
the harvest
Essentially,
piece.
that's right. That is working that pipeline from left to right, right? And
Yes.
that's what most mission organizations have not done, but because it hadn't made sense for the longest period. The missional imperative was to take the resources, both human and money, and put them to work going from right to left. But now, in some ways, the movement church is healthier than the institutional church in some places. And so now we want to take what our movement brothers and sisters have learned and bring it back to the institutional church, not to replace it, but to add to it. And so again, I think you said it well. What we're doing is we're taking disciplines and strategies employed by movement focused churches, and we're bringing it to the institutional church, and we're letting people experience it for a few hours.
So just to tie a little bit of a loop on that, because I love what I feel like we're doing, or what I experienced is I had guys, so Kyle and Aaron they were doing this, they were doing these movement practices. Okay. They came over here, got me doing this. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found is that when this happens, this is anecdotal, please just hear, it actually brings health to this, and it creates a pipeline of people that want to go do this over here. Does that make sense?
Yes, not exclusively, because
Not
think,
exclusively, but
think,
it
think.
can.
Really, what you're doing, Ross, is you're putting teeth back into the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer.
And it brings health.
That's
I mean,
right.
it brings health.
And I don't know an institutional pastor that I've ever met who reads Ephesians 4:11 and 12 and goes, yeah, my church is healthy in that way. They all read that and go, daggone, I wish I had church members that would take the responsibility to let the staff, train them for the work of ministry. Instead, the staff's having to do all of it. I mean, I think pastors want to be able to delegate to their congregations, but we've steeped them in this institutional model for so long. It's an uphill battle. It's hard to get people to engage that way.
Well, and just to give an anecdotal example of what I mean by health over here, health comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes and forms. So it's interesting. I was talking to Paul Kerr this past week. I don't think he'll mind me telling this. He's a pastor, Farmers Branch, who basically totally in, all in, right? And so we were talking, and one of the things that he noticed with the people that were getting involved in the process is their giving went up.
Yeah.
Well, we never mentioned giving. Jim, I've never said a word about money in this. It never occurred to me. It did. But we saw the same thing at Allen with a handful of folks, is that their generosity was catalyzed by pumping the priesthood of the believer. So that's just an anecdotal, and everybody can, boy, you get cheers for that one, right? Money, everybody wants that, right? But that my point is this right here, bringing these principles and processes into this world catalyzes growth, spiritual. Verse 12 basically of Ephesians chapter 4 verse 12 is the fullness of Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
Begins to that water line in the church begins to rise. And so that's what, when I talk about health, um that's one of the byproducts. And then also, to your point, it allows us to begin to engage our community in a different way that won't necessarily walk into a building per se.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we begin to move into phase 5, I guess, does that
Well,
make
see, and the
sense?
thing about it, That all makes perfect sense to me because people money follows vision, right? And most people in this institutional model, I shouldn't say most, a lot of people are frustrated. It's what we often talk about. It's this holy discontent. They're sitting in the pews routinely and they're tithing, but they're just like, man, it just feels like we're losing. Just the church is in decline, and the culture is going the wrong direction, and it's frustrating. And then all of a sudden, the church starts to engage in transforming its community through outreach, and they feel a part of that. Money follows vision, and so people are going to start going, well, man, I really like where my church is going. We're not losing. We're making a difference.
And let me say one other thing, Jim, and is that we're sitting over here, right here, and we're reading the New Testament, the book of Acts, and the New Testament epistles. And you know what it's describing? Is this. And so we're over here in an institutional mindset. And again, I know I'm painting with a broad brush here. Is the New Testament is describing this world right in here, right? Movement. And so what we do is we try to recreate this over here, and the New Testament comes alive to them because now they're doing some of these very simple activities of entering the lostness, proclaiming, forming simple groups. And and this is what we've seen in our church is you begin to read the New Testament from totally different lenses. Over here, it's very academic. It's we're just diving into it, but when you begin to do this stuff over here, it just changes the way you look at the New Testament. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
Anything else you want to add?
Well, I
Oh,
would
go
just
ahead. Go ahead.
I often add this Great Commission pipeline just to make the point that instead of this thing running one direction, that we're looking at this as two direction. Not only can the movement focused church learn and benefit from its engagement with the institutional church, we have to recognize, we have to go into this with a humble spirit, understanding that at this point in history, we can't always be the teachers here. We need to also be the students, and so we need to be willing to learn. I mean, when we see thousands and thousands of churches being planted a month in South Asia, they're doing something right. We ought to study it and figure out what it is and try to emulate it, because there's 120,000 South Asians in DFW.
Yeah. So, can I make a simple suggestion, Jim? And this is just, I think this right here, what you're doing right here with a panel, maybe you and Scott or somebody doing this at the fundraising in September, of walking through this and going, this is what we're doing, guys. We're doing, and I know Westfall Gold would choke on that, but the power of this and the way you walk through it, with maybe having a panel up there that's interacting with this thing, right? And then presenting it, and then go, hey, is there any questions? And having two mics, or something. That I'm going to drop that into your lap and say that this really does change it. Oh, that's what E3 is about. That's what Made to Multiply, and how Made to Multiply plugs in here. And I think that would I think that's a very compelling why.
And I could, if we were to do that, I could see us having a big poster or a backdrop made up with just this picture on, and so that people could throughout the whole weekend could refer as they're doing a presentation. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story that comes from phase 2. Exactly. I'm going to tell you a story that comes out of phase 4.
I really think that would, the light's going to come on and go, I want to give to that. And the recognizing that most of the people in this room were born baptized and will die in the institutional world, right?
Mm-hmm.
But hey, this is what we're about, and I think that that would um, there you go. You know what, as somebody who's been in this now for 6 7 years, whatever, this is so, and when we do intensives, Jim, this is what the people tell us at the intensive flips them.
Mm-hmm.
They come back and they go, why didn't you do this? We do this on day 2, I think, of the intensive, in our intensive, and they always go, you should have done that at the beginning. I've heard this over and over and over again. So anyway, there's
Well,
my,
see, I agree. I have heard people, for instance, Troy Cooper. I presented this once out in California to a group that he was with, and he came back and he said, "Jim, it's too far in the weeds for folks to get." He said, you need to go back to something more simple." Uh, Now, I think it depends on the audience. I think the audience that comes to uh, that fundraiser, that's a sophisticated group. They're all high net worth individuals, and they're used to complex questions, and so, and the reason I love this is because I felt the same way the first time I saw this. I was like, this is why I've been feeling what I've been feeling. It's exactly what, and it's why when I went to India, it was like the scales came off my eyes, because I never thought to explain it this way, but that's why this journey I've been on has been so compelling because of this. And so the first time I saw this, I'm like, oh, that's what's happened, and I shouldn't be upset with my church because it's doing what the institutional church does. What I need to do is help my church layer on movement practices.
yeah,
I
yeah,
don't need to rail against the machine and try to burn it down, because there is still a percentage of the population that is attracted to that model, and there always
yeah.
will be in the U.S.
I just think it shows the big picture, and people are into big pictures, big meta narratives. The meta narrative, it's like it begins to, I understand why these activities in institutional church happen, and I'm not here to take a sledgehammer to it, although it could appear that way. Is that, hey, these serve each other. Again, I often tell people, the thing after number institutional is Europe. We have a somewhat of a case study, right? Of examples where the church has run through all 4 phases and is in a
Mm-hmm.
decline. You can say Massachusetts, whatever. I don't know. But any rate, this is
I, I,
good.
I, by the way, I saw a study years ago. It's probably been 5 or 6 years ago, and I wish I could find it, but I've never been able to. But this guy studied the decline of the church in Europe, and then he started looking at the church in the United States to try to determine if we were on the same pathway. And his conclusions were really fascinating. He said we are on the same pathway, but the foundation of the church is different in the United States, because it was sort of a breakaway.
Right.
It was the guys that didn't like the state sponsored churches in Europe, and so that he said that there is a certain percentage within the American church that is always going to be fundamentalist, and that what he perceives is the church is going to continue to shrink, and you're going to see a lot of the mainline denominations move into a progressive sort of heretical Christianity, but there's always going to be a hard kernel of the American church that stays true, but they're going to become outsiders culturally, and
Outliers,
they
yeah.
will eventually become a persecuted minority. Now, maybe not persecuted to the extent that we see in the Middle East or in South Asia, but that hard kernel is going to become the intolerant, bigoted, weirdos, which means we'll be back in the historical You know, that's historically where the church has been. I mean, that is that Jesus tells us, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. So it just means his conclusion was, we will the church in the United States is never going to go completely the way the European church has gone, but that remnant that's left is going to be more, it's going to be more historically normative for the church. We've been living in a bubble for 250 years.
Well, I think it's also uh, interesting to overlay the kingdom parables on this, of the parable of the sower, the parable of the wheat and tares, that when the gospel does go out, the tares begin to say. So I think that there are places,
Yep.
without becoming what's called eisegesis. I don't want to, that we can lay kingdom parables on this and go, oh, I see that there. Like the
Mm-hmm.
mustard seed, where he says it starts small and then it creates a tree and there's birds on it and all this. It creates this massive, and so you do see some of the kingdom parables emerging within this observational tool called the four phases.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Jim, I actually got a bolt here. I got a meeting next, but let me ask you: do you mind if I have a YouTube page and I just use it for training? Would you mind if I put this video on there? Is there anything you said that would be out of bounds, or you wouldn't
Mm-mm.
want to?
No,
I
I don't
just
think
want to
so.
make sure no one
No.
watches it. I just send some people I train to this. Is that all right?
Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
Well,
Now,
hey,
what I
Jim,
think what I'm going to do, I'm going to redo this slide, and I'm going to add a fifth phase on here and
will
call
you
it
send that
post
to me?
Christian. But that I built this slide a couple years ago, and you can't imagine how difficult it was to do that.
Oh, I
So it
bet.
it's going to take me several hours to modify it. But when I do, I'll send you a copy of it.
Yeah, I'd like that. Hey, Jim, thanks. I really do appreciate your time. This is really good. I'm actually going to be doing this at DTS in a couple weeks, at their
Oh
missions conference.
man, walking walking into the belly of the
Right.
beast, baby.
No, no, man. I believe in this, right? And so, any rate, listen, I appreciate your time, Jim, and
No
uh,
problem.
and I really do.